In a study of history, Toynbee describes the universal state as the final stage of the civilizational cycle. Will Western civilization become one giant universal state, or will Europe and America go down different paths? Similar to the divide in Cynic civilization between Japan and China. In his 2012 book, Coming Apart, Charles Murray gave a startling prediction on the future of Europe. The simplest way in which the advanced welfare state will lose attractiveness is the looming bankruptcy of the European welfare states. The financial bankruptcy is not anything that even the cleverest planner can avoid. As publicly financed benefits grow, so do the populations who find that they need them. The more people who need benefits, the more government bureaucracy is required. The more people who rely on support from the government, and the larger the government, the fewer the people in the private sector who pay for the benefits and for the apparatus of the state. The larger the number of people who depend on government either for benefits or their jobs, the larger the constituency for voting for ever larger government. These are realities that have become manifest in every advanced Western country. They have brought some European welfare states within sight of bankruptcy as I write. Fertility rates that are far below replacement throughout Western Europe ensure the productive native-born population will fall still more in the years to come. There is no permanent way out of the self-destructive dynamics of the welfare state. But Europe has a tempting palliative. Encouraging large-scale immigration of younger populations who work in the private sector and pay taxes that make up the revenue deficit. It won't work forever. Sooner or later, the immigrants too will succumb to the incentives that the welfare state sets up. But the more immediate problem is that most of the new workers come from cultures that are radically different from those of Western Europe. In some cases, those cultures despise the values that led to the welfare state. The United States will have a chance to watch these events unfold before our own situation becomes as critical. And the site will be a powerful incentive to avoid going down the same road. The divergence in economic fortunes of the US and Europe since 2008 is now well documented, which seems to vindicate Murray's thesis that Europe is on the wrong track. It is likely that there will be future frictions over NATO spending, whoever is in the White House. The two possible outcomes to this are that either European governments will have to increase their defense budgets at a time when finances are already strained, or the US will eventually grow tired of subsidizing European security, and it will be forced to face the world alone. In a world of civilizational competition, people will compare their living standards with those of others, and will become increasingly unhappy with their leaders if they feel they are being left behind in terms of global living standards. We are going to examine Murray's prediction by looking at the current state of the UK government's finances. Britain's welfare state was born in 1948 with the establishing of the NHS, after William Beveridge had documented the 5 evils of want, disease, ignorance, squalor and idleness in his 1942 report. Since its establishment, post-war government spending has never gone below 35% of GDP, whereas at the British Empire's greatest geographical reach in 1922, public sector spending was 27.8% of GDP. This spending has been maintained by continuous government borrowing in the past 25 years. Net debt as a proportion of GDP has jumped from 30% to over 100%. The big jumps accrued over the 2008 financial crash and the COVID lockdowns. The bond market can be confusing, but essentially the Bank of England buys many of the government bonds, so in a sense the government is paying back itself. This is about a third of the total. However, this causes money printing and drives inflation. The rest comes from private investors who need to be repaid. During what has been described by the left as 14 years of austerity, government spending has increased every year, and little if nothing was done about the vast government debt. UK GDP per capita has risen steadily since 1955, but it is beginning to stagnate, which combined with inflation represents a drop in living standards. I am not sure if we will see any sovereign debt crisis in Europe in the next 10 years, but this meme is a perfect illustration of how America, China, and Europe are viewed on the world stage. If it continues to have faltering growth, then the financing of the welfare state becomes harder. The end of globalism and the threat of a return to the era of tariffs is unlikely to be beneficial to the global economy, and Europe is poorly placed to react to any future crisis that might be around the corner. There is the possibility that if right-wing parties gain power in France and Germany, then Europe would move closer to the American model, and Western civilization might face the challenges of the 21st century truly united. Alas, right now, they seem destined to drift further apart. The revelations of Doge in the US will reinforce suspicions European taxpayers have about where their taxes are actually spent when subjected to forensic accounting. European government finances might be even worse. Britain is the European country closest to the American sphere, despite the animosity between the current governments. Hypothetically, if NATO did disband, the US would be practically removed from the Eurasian landmass, and Britain's position as an unsinkable aircraft carrier just off its shore would increase its strategic value to the US. If tariffs do return to international trade, Britain is in a unique position to take advantage as a conduit of European and American trade. The social contract meme was a product of the anger of those who feel they pay into a system with little to nothing in return. European leaders have welfare states they can barely afford and populations who already feel they are taxed to the limit, reducing their room for manoeuvre as every hard decision upsets some constituency. When I first saw this diagram, in the Guardian newspaper no less, it came as quite a shock, as I'd always been assured by my Marxist professors that there was always millions of pounds spent on defence, while there was no money for the poor or the NHS. When you consider that the Departments of Work and Pensions, the NHS, and Education are all parts of the welfare state, even back in 2010, it was almost half of the government's entire budget.
Once you are in capacity benefit for 12 months or more, you are more likely to die than you are to get a job.
There's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no tomorrows. There's no future. There's no prospect.
In Britain and Europe, the demographic crisis is well known. Something people are beginning to realise is the ever-increasing number of the adult population receiving either the personal independence payment or disability living allowance, which as of August 2023 was 4.4 million people, or around 5% of the workforce and close to the combined populations of Wales and Northern Ireland. This cost the UK taxpayer around £40 billion a year. In comparison, the government R&D budget is around £20 billion a year. Whatever you think of the morality of these arrangements, the more European governments spend on welfare, the further they will fall behind the more technologically advanced America and China. The harsh reality is, many people getting around £2,000 a month on DLA will have little motivation to find a full-time job, particularly if it pays under 28 grand a year, as this would represent a loss of income. Many governments allow this number to grow, as the alternative is to have increasing unemployment, which never looks good, and it will probably expand over the coming years. When you add in the pensioners, unemployed, school kids and university students, around 32 million people altogether, nearly 50% of the UK population, is economically inactive. They only contribute if you are so Keynesian that you would pay someone to dig a hole and then fill it back up. Opportunity costs. And if we look at the 1.1 trillion budget for the UK government last year, it is obvious that hypothetically, Britain could easily match the US naval budget of $250 billion per annum, which is the equivalent to around £208 billion. We just choose to fund the welfare state instead. Although I am starting to think the whole point of the Chinese Belt and Road program is to undermine US naval power as a force in the world. The policy of mass immigration pursued by Western governments to increase their tax base has not generated enough growth to counterbalance the strain of increased population on public services, and is becoming politically untenable. Europe could be on the brink of a decline in living standards that will exacerbate the divisions and hostilities in its politics. For a long time, during the relative economic prosperity of the post-war world, different groups could be appeased and bought off, and a little borrowing or debt could always be paid off later. If that prosperity dries up, harsh choices will have to be made, and it is likely that whoever loses out will take to the streets. To broadly summarize the major European economies, Germany manufactures, France and Italy have agriculture and luxury goods, while Britain specializes in financial services. The FTSE is the engine of the British economy. This is why Rachel Reeves needs to remove stamp duty from shares, so as not to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. This tax simply drives money out of the country, as investors in the UK can still buy shares on the better performing American markets without paying stamp duty, which is why the UK pension funds invest their billions in the US, and there is the threat of companies delisting. Even The Guardian thinks so. Either Europe returns to consistent economic growth, or soon China and America will be referring to it as the Third World.